All right, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the annual GRCC Social Science Department Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. We have a full week's worth of events planned, but I do want to point out one item in particular that you might be interested in, and that is our keynote lecture, which is Thursday night from 7 to 8:30 here in the multipurpose room in Sneeden. Dr. Ed Bloom, who is going to be talking about his book, The Color of Christ. So if you're interested in that, please attend. Today's speaker is Gordan Vurusic, a professor of political science here at GRCC. And he is an expert in political theory, American political theory, and international relations. And I'm not going to take any more of your time. We're going to turn it over to the star of the show today, Professor Vurusic.
You mispronounced my name.
I'm sorry. You can clap for him.
All right. Everybody can hear me, I suppose. Okay. I wish everybody a very good morning. I hope you're doing all very well. When my chair of department, Professor Mike Light, who just introduced me, asked me to do something for this conference, I thought I would be talking about so-called normative aspects of equality and justice, which is the title of the title of the talk that you can see on the poster of the conference in the program. But you know, sometimes thinking and writing about these things is like driving in a tunnel. You just see what is in front of you. Sometimes you don't see the big picture. So when I finished the presentation, I thought, well, it shouldn't be only about theory. It also should be about empirical evidence. And it shouldn't only about normative theory. Normative theory is just how things should be, but it should also be about how things are. Although, as I teach my students in political theory class, it's very difficult to separate notions about what things should be like and how they're really like. So my purpose this morning is to do a few things, right? First of all, I will start with the hypothesis that inequality is good. And when I'm talking about inequality, I'm talking about economic equality, or better to say, income disparity. Why do I start with this hypothesis? I'm starting with this hypothesis because in the early works on economic equality, that was the argument that was made. Economic inequality is good. I'll explain what these theories think, why economic inequality is good. Then I talk a little bit about political theories on the right that agree with that particular notion, that economic inequality in most cases is good. And then I will talk about a reaction to these theories from the left of the political spectrum, which says economic inequality is not good, it's bad. Then we'll take a look at some empirical measurements of economic inequality. The main empirical measurement of economic inequality that economists, political scientists, and sociologists use is so-called the Gini index. Gini index, I'll explain exactly what it is, but Gini index measures the level of inequality in countries, regions, states, cities, and so on and so forth. Right? So we'll take a look at how Gini index is distributed all over the world. Then we'll talk about causes of this inequality, and I will make brief remarks about what I think is the future of economic inequality. So this particular talk has two major emphases. One emphasis is on theory, and one emphasis is on international analysis. I will not talk only about the United States, but I will talk about the world in more general terms. Okay, so let us start. This is the starting hypothesis that I was talking about in the introduction. And the starting hypothesis, economic inequality is good for economic growth. Why? Well, there are several different reasons why theories of economic inequality, who claim that economic inequality is good, there are several reasons why they claim that economic inequality is good, right? One of the reasons is that resources are channeled to more efficient uses. In other words, if resources are not more optimally used, if resources are used in such a way to basically produce economic inequality. This economic inequality will basically force the people and the economy at large to use resources for producing more beneficial, more stuff that basically creates more economic value. Right? For example, if you are stuck in a minimum wage job, right, that's a great recipe for you to be much poorer than people who have college education and who have gainful employment, right? Because you're stuck in a minimum wage job, right? This minimum wage job produces very high level of inequality between you and others who have a college degree and gainfully employed with a good salary and benefits. Right? That means that you are inefficiently using your resources. One of your resources is labor. Right? So this particular job, the fact that you are basically at the bottom of the scale, presumably is going to force you to better yourself, right? To gain skills, to gain training that would get you out of the minimum wage job, right? And to use your resources, which means your labor, your knowledge, much more efficiently, right? In that particular sense, proponents of economic equality argue economic inequality is good because it forces you to get out of the economic bottom and basically do something better, right? Economic equality, therefore, then relocates resources across occupation, industries, and regions, right? For example, there is a great example of China, right? China basically started its reforms, privatization of its economy in 1979, right? China started its reforms as a factory of the world, right? Factory of the world that produces cheap goods because the labor is mainly cheap, right? But China has been changing, right? The more demand for Chinese labor there is, the price of that labor goes up, right? The more skills Chinese workers acquire, the more desire they have to basically improve their lives, to enter the middle class, the more likely it is that they're going to get educated and get better employment with salaries, with higher salaries and benefits, right? So what is happening, for example, now in China, that China is outsourcing its production to poor countries, right? In 80s, in 90s, China was the country that basically got production from rich countries because it had cheap labor. The labor is getting more expensive in China, and therefore China is exporting basically the jobs that require cheap labor to other Asian countries, especially places like Bangladesh, places like Vietnam, and so on and so forth. Right? Inequality is positive in innovation, right? Proponents argue, right? Inequality is great for innovation because, once again, right, if basically you have, if people are stuck in bad jobs, right, they will basically want to get out of that job, and they will basically try to innovate within their occupations. They will try to innovate within their work. They will try to open their own private businesses, right, and thus get ahead in life. I think many of you are getting education in a community college to do exactly that, right? To improve your lives, right? To get better jobs, and basically to get ahead, right? Proponents of economic inequality are saying that economic inequality also prevents inefficient government spending, right? Why is that? Because one way in which you can achieve equality in the economy, one main way in which you can achieve economy is basically to have a fairly strong welfare state, right? In Europe, they call it the nanny state, the state that pays for education, it pays for your health care, it pays fairly good wages. Even if you're unemployed, there is a very strong union protection and so on and so forth, right? Proponents of economic inequality are saying this kind of spending on keeping people where they are if they are low on economic ladder, right? This particular way of government spending is very inefficient, right? Because it doesn't produce innovation, doesn't produce entrepreneurship, doesn't basically make people get out of poverty, right? The proponents of economic inequality are saying if people receive relatively high government benefits, while being unemployed, then these high government benefits are not going to produce any new value. Right? They may basically enable people to survive in a relatively short term, right? But people do not have incentive to better themselves and to basically become more productive members of the economy. So what are the philosophical approaches on economic inequality on the left, right? These are basically these economic approaches of to economic inequality on the left. When I talk about left, I mean the left of the political spectrum. I'm not sure whether Democratic Party in the United States is left enough for what I really mean. So when I talk about approaches to economic inequality on the left, I'm mainly talking about research on the European left. Right? European left is much more left, right? Is much more pro-nanny state than American left is. Right? Marxist, for example. Right? Marxism is an ideology which basically claims that communism is the highest level of human development. Capitalism, according to Marxists, creates two bad things. One is exploitation, where in order to gain profit, the owners of the means of production basically pay their workers less than their labor is worth on the market, right? So the difference between how much laborers are paid and how much their labor is worth on the market is exploitation for Marx. Right? But worse than that, right? Marx thinks that capitalism produces alienation, right? Alienation of people from each other, right? Alienation simply means estrangement. When you say that people are alienated from each other, that means that they become strangers to each other. Why? Because capitalism creates social classes, right? And because capitalism creates social classes, people who basically belong to different social classes usually do not interact very well, right? If you think about yourself, or maybe even your parents, how many of your older generations basically interact with the different social class than they are, right? Yes. So Marxists also think that because of this alienation, right, because of the fact that in capitalism people become strangers to each other, right, that the ruling class, the class who has money, right, the ruling class for Marx is the one that is the class of bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie are the ones who basically have the control over the means of production. Right? So Marxists think that the ruling class, because it has money, because it controls the means of production, are the ones not only with economic power, but also with political power. Right? So Marxists think that capitalism is actually an enemy to democracy. Right? Because the more money you have, according to Marxists, right, the more political power you have. Right? The ideal of democracy is the one in which every member of society, every group in society, is capable of almost equally voicing their concerns and putting political pressures on other groups, right, in order to protect and promote their interests. Right? This particular behavior in which one group in society has more power than the others, right? Behavior in which one group in society garners or generates as much benefits to itself without thinking about the rest of the society. Or in other words, a society in which one group basically generates as many benefits as possible to itself by exploiting other groups in society, that particular behavior in economics and in political science is called rent-seeking. Right? Which basically, I mean, translated into the language of Marxism, bourgeoisie is basically rent-seeking. It's seeking rents. Right? It's exploiting the people who economically depend on them. And social liberalism, right? Social liberalism is another ideology which gets its inspiration from the Marxists, right? I put Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics belongs to the idea of social liberalism. Those of you who took economics class or know that from somewhere else, right? Keynesian economics is so-called demand-side economics, right? What does it mean? I mean, demand-side economics is claiming that in order to get out of economic crisis, for example, right, you should basically increase the demand of population. So when the population has more money in their pockets, right, then they're able to buy more. The demand for goods and services increases, right, which basically gives incentives for companies to produce more goods and services, which makes companies employ more people. Then these people have more money, and so on and so forth. Right? How does Keynesian economics pays for it? Right? Pays for basically programs that put government money into their pockets. Well, it pays from the future earnings. The bet that Keynesian economics makes is a bet in which, because of the increased demand, more and more people will have more and more money. Therefore, in the future, they will pay more and more taxes. More and more people will pay more and more taxes. And therefore, the government will get the money back that it gave out. So social liberalism, however, wants to keep capitalism, right? Social liberalism does not want to basically abolish capitalism as Marxists would like to do. Right? Social liberalism would like to keep capitalism. Social liberalism means that means that social liberalism would like to keep private property over means of production. It wouldn't like to abolish it as Marxists would like, right? But at the same time, there should be some kind of government intervention into the market in order to ensure some level of economic equality. Social liberalism in economics is usually called market socialism. I think that's what Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Bill Clinton, former President of the United States, were saying when they were talking about the third way, right? Third way is this notion that there is some kind of middle ground between hardcore capitalism and hardcore socialism, right? That you can still keep the best from both worlds, that you can keep the best from capitalism, which basically is private property and incentives that this private property creates, and you can basically create some kind of economic equality, and that economic equality would basically be ensured through government programs. Right? On the left, we also have a social justice theory. Right? I remember my country, Croatia, when we basically got away from Yugoslavia, that we were part of, and when we were a new country, we were basically moving from so-called socialism, communism, dictatorship to so-called capitalism/democracy. Sometimes these two always go together. So we were saying, okay, we want to become democratic and capitalist country, but at the same time, we would also to be a country with the social justice. And then, of course, there is a new can of worms, which ask, what is social justice? Right? What does it mean to be economically just? Right? I mean, there are many proposals in the history of Western philosophy about what is social justice. Probably the most famous one is the utilitarian proposal by John Stuart Mill, 19th century British philosopher, who said, the best society in which you basically is the one in which you create the highest level of happiness for the highest number of people. That's as just as you can get. You cannot basically create justice for everybody. But social justice theory is basically saying that that meritocracy, the view, the right, the view from the political right, which claims that goods and services should be distributed according to how much each individual deserves, right? Which opens another can of worms by saying, so what does it mean to deserve, right? In America, it means to work hard. I'm from Croatia, so when I came to the United States first time, people kept telling me, oh, I'm working very hard. I said, why the hell is that important? Why are you keep telling me that you work very hard? What is, I mean, where I came from in Eastern Europe is the boasting value is I work as little as I can and can still have a good life, right? So social justice theory is pointing out Anthony Giddens, who is one of the main proponents, traditional proponents of social justice theory. He teaches at London School of Economics, right? He claims that there is a tension, there is a contradiction between the idea of democracy, which means the meritocracy, which means to everybody according to how much they deserve, right? And democracy. Right? So meritocracy and democracy are in opposition to each other. Giddens is saying, why? Because those who deserve more will accumulate more, not only in terms of economic power, in terms of economic wealth, but they will also accumulate more in terms of political power. Right? So just because somebody deserves more, based on how hard they work, does not necessarily mean, according to Giddens, that he or she should get more. Because the health of the overall society could be in danger, because those who get more, because they deserve more, could get more of political and economic power, and therefore basically go to this rent-seeking behavior in which they exploit others for their own benefits. I mean, what all these left theories have in common is that the well-being of society at large is much more important than the well-being of an individual. Sometimes I say that Jesus Christ was the first communist, right? Because the well-being of the collective, the well-being of the group, the well-being of others, right, in the left-wing worldview is more important than the well-being of an individual. Right? For Marxists, we are all individuals, we are all just small wheels in the big machine of society. It's not how well off I am. That's not the question that Marxists pose, right? The Marxists pose the view in which how well society as a group is. So even, so according to social justice theory, even if we deserve more, according to some kind of constructed merit that we basically decided upon in society, even if we deserve more, we shouldn't get more if getting us more means that the health of the society at large is in any way being threatened. Amartya Sen, right? Sen is a Nobel Prize winner. He's an Indian economist, right? But he does a lot of so-called developmental economics. And he's very highly regarded in political science circles as well. He basically came up with this very influential human development approach. And he basically comes on the side of very humane approach to the questions of equality and inequality. His main question is how much economic inequality, right, destroys human ability. So if you are poor and blind and unhealthy and sick and you cannot afford to heal yourself because you don't have money and you don't have health insurance, right? For Sen, this is outrageous. This is not just some collateral damage of economic system. Right? For Sen, this is outrageous because it destroys, it undermines the abilities, the things that you would be able to do if you were enabled by the society, if you were enabled by the society to become a productive citizen of that society. So distribution of wealth from the rich towards the poor and disabled for Sen is not something that is merely moral. Right? For Sen, the distribution of wealth from the rich towards the poor is something that is of utmost humane importance. Right? Is the question, what do we owe to each other? Right? We owe to each other not only to, as the United States usually has, the equality of opportunity. And somehow we have to create these opportunities all by ourselves. We have to pull ourselves by our bootstraps, even if we don't have boots, right? But redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor for Sen is something that is basically creating the human ability to pursue that opportunity. That's why his approach is called human development. He said the distribution of wealth in a society should be in the function of developing human ability to do things that are good for that human individually, but also to do things that are good for the society itself. These are philosophical approaches on the left side of the spectrum, and philosophical approaches to inequality on the right side of the spectrum. I chose Robert Nozick. Robert Nozick is, used to be, before he died, used to be, when I was younger, I was libertarian. So Robert Nozick was sort of my idol. And Robert Nozick basically said, I mean, libertarian, for those of you who don't know, libertarians, primary value of each libertarian is a personal freedom. It's basically the understanding of a realization of each person's humanity. Each person can realize or implement his or her abilities fully if they are not basically prevented from doing so by the government. Right? So any intervention by the government into the market, into the wealth distribution, into people's personal lives, for libertarians is basically at least damage, if not destruction, of the personal human freedom. So for Nozick, whenever the government gets into the business of redistributing wealth, from the rich to the poor, the so-called Robin Hood policy, steal from the rich and give to the poor. Whenever the government does that, Nozick thinks that the government commits an act of aggression. The government commits an act of aggression against individuals' freedom. Nozick, as well as von Mises, right? Von Mises is a famous Austrian economist. Austrian economists were from Austria, of course. Famous economic school in the 1920s, libertarian school. Many of their views today have been discredited by modern economists, right? But Nozick likes von Mises. Right? Nozick thinks that inequality among humans is natural. Right? That this inequality among humans, as what Mises said, should be preserved. I mean, inequality among humans is the only reason, according to Mises, the inequality among humans is the only reason why we get together as a society. Right? Inequality among humans is the reason why it is that we trade, why it is that we have business transactions, right? For example, idea of comparative advantage. If you're better at making shoes, right? Or let's do something more interesting. If you're better at making cheese, right? And I'm better at making wine, right? Because of our unequal abilities, right? Your ability to make cheese and my ability to make wine, right? We get together because I cannot drink wine without cheese and you cannot eat cheese without wine, right? So the inequality is very reason why we create human interactions on the market. Inequality is very reason why it is that we basically do any kind of economic transaction. If we were all equal in our abilities, right, then if all of us had the same comparative advantage, for God's sake, right, then transaction trade would not exist. Economic inequality, on the other hand, for Mises, is just a result. It's just a result of this natural inequalities in abilities that Mises is talking about. However, both Nozick and von Mises were very much in favor of legal equality. He doesn't buy, von Mises and Nozick do not buy this Marxist view that just because you have more economic power, that just because you have more economic power, that necessarily you will have more political power. Nozick and von Mises do not buy this thing that if you have more economic power, that you can necessarily buy a legal system. So that those who are poorer, that those who are poorer will necessarily politically and legally suffer. Mises and Nozick believe in the ability of society to create institutions, to create rules and regulations, minimal rules and regulations, right, that would enable the society to keep legal and political equality in the face of economic inequality. Mises and Nozick do not think that economic inequality, political and legal inequality as a result of economic inequality is just given from the sky. They believe that it can be addressed. Famous contemporary, fairly contemporary, libertarian economist Milton Friedman famously say, a society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both. Friedman was always debating whether there is one of the main questions that he addresses is whether it is necessary to have democracy in order to have successful capitalism. For him, freedom and democracy are interchangeable concepts. Right? And Friedman's answer is emphatic: yes, you must have democracy in order to have successful capitalism. Right? Maybe the Chinese would disagree. Although, I mean, it's more complicated than that. One can argue that Chinese capitalism is so-called state capitalism. We can argue whether that's possible or not. Right? But Friedman is saying if individuals do not have freedom to influence policies that affect their economic transactions, then such capitalism is necessarily going to fail. If you are an owner of a small business, right, Friedman thinks that in order for your small business to be successful, you have to be able to say to your government freely, right, what kind of regulations you need and what kind of regulations you don't need for your small business. Right? If there is no democracy, if people's voices are not heard, then Friedman is arguing it's impossible for businesses in democracy it's impossible for business in dictatorships to be successful. because government can then do whatever they like. Through their regulations, they can destroy the business if the owners of this business, if people who work there, do not have the power to influence the government in terms of how it regulates it. Let's take a look now at empirical issues. This is a map of so-called Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient and an index. You don't have to know the formula, how it's calculated. I will not show you a curve that shows how it's calculated. Right? I just want to basically tell you that Gini index is widely accepted index of economic inequality, not only in economics, but in sociology, political sciences, and so forth. Right? The higher the Gini index, right? The higher the Gini index, the less equality, the less economic equality there is. Right? Which means the Gini index in the value of 1 is a situation in which just one person has all the wealth. The quite opposite, if you have Gini index of 0, right, that means that all members of society have equal wealth. Gini index is usually measured in terms of what is the share of the income that top 10% has, top 10 highest earners, highest income people in society, and what is the percentage of the wealth that lowest earners have. This is the Gini index. This is basically the Gini index map of the world, right? You see that the country, basically the country, these are different regions of the same country, but the country with the highest Gini index in the world is South Africa. Right? South Africa has Gini index more of 0.6 or 6, right? Which means that the wealth is very unequally distributed. Oops, sorry. You have the United States, possibly the countries that we are most interested in. You see that the Gini index in the United States is basically the same like Gini index right here. What country is that? Does anybody know? Does anybody know what country this is? This one? Which one? China. That's right. That's right. Some of the countries with basically high Gini indexes, which means a low level of equality or high level of inequality, are here in South America, especially the country of Brazil. If you take a look at what are the countries with relatively low Gini indexes, right, that's pretty strongly correlated with the level of welfare policies that the countries have. Right? If you look at Scandinavian countries, right, this is up there. Does anybody know which country this is? This narrow country on the top? That's right, Norway, and this one, Sweden, and this one. This is Finland, this is Sweden. So Scandinavian countries are basically very well known for their strong welfare policies. Right? I remember when I lived in the Netherlands in the 1990s, all students, regardless of what they studied, basically received a stipend from the government, right? A living stipend. None of the students had to pay tuition. You could receive your stipend from the government until you were 27 for undergraduate studies. So you would have a bunch of people who would just study different things without ever finishing anything. Because for a student, it was fairly well to live there. Right? Sweden has this scheme in which basically if for each child that you have, the government pays you a salary until that child is 18. In Norway, for example, I have a good friend in Norway who has pretty strong migraines, and the government pays her because she cannot work because of the migraines. She will receive a compensation for having migraine for the rest of her life. So these Scandinavian countries and many other European countries are high-tax countries, countries in which the taxes are very high, right? But in return, basically, people in these countries receive a high level of benefits. For example, Sweden is called the bumblebee economy. Right? You know how bumblebee is a big, fat, but still flies? Sweden is called bumblebee economy because despite all the odds, it still works. Despite the high taxes, despite the strong welfare state, Sweden is still a well-off country. Of course, there are many immigration problems now and so on and so forth. Right? There are also problems with many European countries being unable to sustain this high level of welfare. But that's perhaps a topic for a different conversation. Right? This is global distribution of wealth. Right? Look at this. Top 0.001% of the world people has 30%, has 1/3 of the world wealth. Right? Top 0.001 number of people has 30% of the world wealth. Look at this. Bottom 99.9% of the world population, almost 100% of the population, has 19% of the world wealth. So you see how very large amount of money, around $16.7 trillion, 30% of the world wealth, is basically concentrated in a very small number of people. What is, you remember how at the beginning we were talking about these theories about this hypothesis that inequality is good, that inequality is good for the economic growth. Right? Economic growth is just a measurement about, it's a percentage by how much gross domestic product grows per year. There are a bunch of economists who were looking at this relationship in the sense of whether the more equality or less equality means higher growth. Right? But there wasn't a clear linear correlation. When I say linear correlation, that simply means that that the straight line was not basically a graphic representation of the correlation. It's more like a curve, right? And so here you have a basically low growth rate right here and low inequality right here. Right? When you have basically low growth rate and low level of inequality, then you have incentive traps, free riding, labor shirking, high forcing costs, right? What basically this means is that if you have high level of equality, right? Neoliberal economists will argue, well, because this high level of equality, which means that the wealth is transferred from the rich to the poor, basically undermines the incentive for the people to basically get better, educate themselves, receive training, and become wealthier parts of the society. Right? Many economists are saying that that there is an optimal Gini coefficient. Right? That there is an optimal level, the best level of economic inequality in terms of how much this level promotes economic growth. Right? So it's not like the more equality, higher growth. Or it's not like more inequality, higher growth. Right? Yes. It's more like, look, there is a certain level of inequality. You need certain level of inequality to create incentive within society to basically promote the economic growth. Right? But if this inequality is higher than that optimal level, right, you have erosion of social cohesion, you have social conflicts, you have uncertainty about property rights, all the negative stuff, right? that can create a violence in the society. Right? I mean, if you look at the rate of violent incidents in the United States, the rate of violent incident in the United States is higher than in any other developed country. Why? Sociologists are claiming that's because of the gap between the rich and the poor, because of the high level, relatively high level of economic inequality in the United States as opposed to many other developed countries. The United States, among all the other developed countries, has the lowest, highest tax rates for individuals. Not for corporations, but for individuals, for example. So this gap between have and have-nots is basically also, after a certain level of inequality, something that creates conflict, crime in society, and the absence of social cohesion. However, if you look at the correlation between Gini coefficient and some social categories, such as life expectancy, then this correlation is pretty positive. Or negative, whatever you want to, however you want to look at it, right? Yes. So here we have a study. This is from a scholarly study, right? Here you have basically a scatter plot, right? It basically shows you that the higher the Gini coefficient, which means the higher the level of inequality. Right? In general, not perfectly, right? You see, the correlation coefficient is minus 0.864. There was a perfect correlation, right? Basically this number would be minus 1, right? However, p-value is pretty good. It's pretty low, right? 0.001. In statistics, this p-value is telling us that basically the room for error in this statistical model is very small. There is very little error. So in general, you have, for example, the United States, right? Which has Gini coefficient at around 40 or 0.40. It depends on whether you want to look at it as an index or as a coefficient, right? It has a lower, for example, life expectancy, right? In average for both genders around between 70 and 7.5, right? As opposed to Japan. Japan is the country with the highest life expectancy in the world, and it has one of the lowest Gini coefficients. Right? Why? One of the reasons is that in Japan, it's very easy to get preventive health care. Right? Why? Because it's paid for by the government. And the taxes are fairly high. So there is a strong transfer from the wealthy to the poorer members of the society. So while there is no clear correlation between, there's no linear correlation between the Gini index and the economic growth, there is a definite correlation. A number of studies show that there is a definite correlation, for example, between Gini index and life expectancy. Right? The higher the economic equality, the higher the life expectancy. Gini coefficient and happiness. How do we know how happy people are? Well, we ask them. This is from the Economist. The Economist is a fairly well-regarded British magazine that deals with economic and political issues. They did this chart based on the data from OECD. OECD is Organization of Developed Countries, and Gallup poll is the famous American polling organization. Right? So this is the correlation between Gini index and how happy people feel. Is there a clear correlation between the two? No, right? And Economist is a fairly, I would say, right-leaning publication. So in this particular article, they were sort of making fun, saying, oh, well, there is a hypothesis that the higher your taxes, the happier you are. But here is the chart that shows there, there isn't this relationship, right? And you can see, I mean, this is the highest score, right? The highest average score of the most satisfied people, the top 10% of most satisfied, right? And this is the highest scores of the least satisfied people. If you look at the gap between the scores, this gap does not necessarily basically depend on the Gini index. Right? Which I think shows us very clearly that people or satisfaction with their life does not necessarily depend on how equally income is distributed. That there are some other factors that make your life happy, in addition to how equally income is distributed. I have a bunch of friends, a bunch of political scientists who do research in Africa. Well, Professor De Vivo, a geographer from our department, does a lot of research in Africa. And he tells me wherever he wants to have the best party with the happiest people, he goes to South Africa. Right? South Africa is the country with the highest Gini index in the world, which means that the highest level of inequality in the world. Right? And when you go to Africa, I was in Angola, I was in Senegal, you can see that people are really enjoying their lives, despite the fact that they are poor, and despite the fact that they are that the wealth is fairly unequally distributed. Maybe that's because of this concoction they drink all the time. However, there are good number of studies that show that more equal countries usually do better in a number of social categories than countries that are less equal, right? So the countries with the high Gini indexes, which means countries with high level of inequality, right? In a bunch of social categories, they basically do much better than countries with low Gini indexes, right? Sorry, vice versa. The countries with high inequality do worse than countries with low inequality. Right? So social trust, right? That sounds pretty logical, right? If you have a big polarization of social classes, countries, the level of social trust between these social classes is fairly low. Right? Educational tests, the average educational test in countries that are more equal, right? Because usually of more equal access to education, good education, right? The average educational tests are better in countries that are more equal than their opposites. Right? The same with crime, social mobility, health, as well as mental, physical, infant mortality, and so forth. Right? You saw, for example, that Japan, both men and women, Japanese men have the highest life expectancy in the world, but they smoke 20 times more cigarettes than the average American man. Why? Because of the access to health care. And better diet, a lot of sushi, of course. But access of health care is very important variable. What is causes of inequality? There is barely anything conclusive in political science. So political scientists and political economists debate about what are the causes of inequality. One of the causes of inequality that is usually most frequently mentioned is education. For example, where I'm coming from, in the country of Croatia, only 8% of the population older than 24 has 4-year college degrees. Only 8%. That means that there is a very small elite of people, to which I fortunately belong. But there is a very small elite of people, right? And there is everybody else. So the gap between those who are educated, who has political and business power, and those who are not, is wide. The United States percentage of 4-year college degrees for the people older than 24 is around 27%. The United States used to be the leader in this particular category. Sweden is the leader, around 32%. Almost a third of the population in Sweden, over 24, has 4-year college degrees. But remember that education is, according to many theories, is also is something that creates inequality, because the economy is becoming more and more complicated. The knowledge that you need for well-paid jobs is more and more complex. Because that knowledge is more and more complex, therefore you need better and better education. Right? And those who are educated then are then in a better position to basically generate higher income. Right? While those who are not educated and do not have the skills necessary for the complex economy are basically stagnating. And stagnating does not mean only staying the same, because if others are advancing and you're staying the same, that means in comparison with others, you're getting lower. Globalization. Companies, one of the main characteristics of globalization is that the companies in the globalized world treat the whole world as a market. It's not if I have a business, if I have a company, and I live in the globalized world, the world without economic borders. Right? I do not only think how much of my stuff I can sell in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the United States, right? I'm also thinking how much of my stuff I can sell in China, in Singapore, in Germany, and so on and so forth, right? So if the whole world is the market, right, I'm able to basically transfer labor, right, transfer production, transfer marketing, transfer sale, wherever I want, wherever I have better economic benefit, whenever it's cheaper, whenever this gap between how much I pay for it and how much I get in return is wider. Right? Which basically means that the jobs here in the United States, right, 20 years ago, in political economy, there's this term called Dutch disease. Right? Doesn't have anything to do with the Dutch in Grand Rapids. Dutch disease is a notion in political economy which says if one country, like the Netherlands, for example, if one country has basically one well-performing economic sector, such as natural gas for the Netherlands, right? Then all the money is going to go into that sector because that sector becomes very profitable. Which means that other sectors who are not connected with the natural gas sector are going to suffer, right? Which happens in the Netherlands in the 1980s, right? 1970s and 1980s, right? It's called Dutch disease. It's a warning. Do not put all your chips in one basket, all your eggs in one basket, right? Michigan used to have Dutch disease. General Motors, right? Ford, Chrysler, right? You went to high school, you didn't do well, but say, GM is going to hire me. You didn't need education, right? General Motors had well-paid jobs, fantastic benefits, great pension plan. Yes. So these three major companies were Dutch disease of Michigan. People didn't have incentive to better themselves because they thought no matter how badly I do in high school, there will always be a good middle-class job for me. In the context of globalization, this does not exist. Right? Anybody can make as good or better cars as GM, Chrysler, or Ford at a cheaper price without union benefits. Right? You could see that a bunch of world companies, car companies, are opening their doors in the United States. BMW in Alabama, Subaru in Indiana. Right? It's not fun anymore to be a BMW from Alabama. I wanted to buy a BMW from Germany. Why not in Michigan? Why aren't other companies opening stuff in Michigan? Because of the Dutch disease, because of the still strong unions that are basically creating terms that some of the other companies are not willing to live by. Is this necessarily good? Is this necessarily bad? I'm not claiming that it's not necessarily good or necessarily bad. I'm just giving you my analysis how it is. Technology. It takes fewer people to do more stuff, to make more stuff, right? Because of technological advancements. Right? Manufacturing processes today are much different than manufacturing processes 50, 60 years ago. Right? They involve high technology for which people need higher and better education. So people with low-level skills and low-level education are not capable to compete even for manufacturing jobs because right, manufacturing jobs are different, and that creates high level of inequality. There's an interesting new book out from Hecker and Pearson. Hecker and Pearson are two political scientists. One is from MIT, Hecker is from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Pearson is from Princeton, I believe. They're claiming that all these stories about technology, education, globalization, they do not apply in the United States. Because they're saying, look, I mean, everything, all these influences on inequality happen in other countries, but the gap between rich and poor in the United States increased much more in the United States than in other developed countries. Why is that? What's so special about the United States that doesn't occur in other developed countries, right? This is a chart that they present, right? Bottom fifth, look at this, bottom fifth. That's the increase from 1978 to 2010, the increase of post-tax income in the United States. Right? So the bottom, right, fifth, the bottom 20%, right? Look at how much salary increase, how much income increase actually, not salary, income increase they had from 1978 to 2010 in real dollars in purchasing power parity, right? 10%. From 1978 to 2010. Look at here, top 1%. Right? Increase their income between 1978 and 2010, right? Almost 100%, 180%. Top 1/10 of 1% increased their income between 1978 and 2010 by 285%. Right? Well, people in the bottom, right? Middle, this is top, this is lowest 20%, middle 20%, next higher 20%, right? Right here, I mean, this is perhaps middle class, right? Around 40%. Right? So why? They're asking, why is it that the United States is so special? Right? They're claiming that the United States has basically a special structure of political power, which they call a policy drift, a special structure of political power that benefits the rich. Why? Because the money, the interest of corporation and private interest in the United States are so closely connected with politics. It is impossible to become an influential politician in the United States, they are claiming, without money from private interests and corporations. So politicians in Congress, on both sides, on Republican and Democrats, are working fairly hard in order basically to make sure that the interests of the rich private companies, right, are strongly protected. No matter how many times President Obama mentioned that he wants to increase the minimum wage, it's not going to happen. No matter how many times the workers in Michigan and other states say, we don't want a right to work law, it's not going to happen. We do have the right to work law, right? No matter how many times, basically, there is a pressure to the contrary, the tax on investment income will be lower than the tax on the income that is basically from the regular salaries. Right? No matter how many times we are trying to prevent that, right, there will always be loopholes for the companies to move their production abroad and thus basically and thus basically pay lower taxes. So Pearson and Hager and Pearson blame both parties, although they're saying that Republicans are wearing black hats and Democrats are wearing gray hats. Right? Republicans as a party, as a unity, according to Hager and Pearson, promote interest of wealthy companies who then basically, through their policies and economic practices, create high level of inequality. While on the one hand, Democrats, Hager and Pearson are saying, Democrats are on the surface and publicly for many policies that are helping the poor to get out of poverty, but at the same time when there is a private interest at stake that contributes money to these particular democratic politicians, then they basically vote against the interest of equality. For example, they mentioned Chuck Schumer, who is a senator of New York, who oftentimes talks about the interest of the poor and interest of the lower classes, but at the same time votes always strongly for the interest of the Wall Street, in whose interest is to definitely not to promote economic equality. What is my future? What are my views about the future inequality? Right? I think it's not going to get better in terms of high-level equality. I think it's going to get worse. But maybe if I have to leave you some time for questioning, maybe we can discuss that in more depth. Thank you very much for your attention.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand. We'd like to bring the microphone around just so we can hear the question as it's being recorded. You won't be on film necessarily. I'm not going to ask you to lip sync or anything. It's fine.
So you said the future of inequality with the sad face?
More with a skeptical face.
So why do you think that it's not going to get any better? I mean, is it because of the corporations and, I mean, are you talking overall, globally or locally?
The future is always about creating theoretical hypotheses, right? We don't have empirical data about the future, right? So the future is basically a hypothesis based on what happened in the past, right? But does not necessarily matter that it's going to happen that the same thing is going to happen in the future, right? So I think it's just a simple pattern, right? In my view, economy and jobs in contemporary and modern economies that are creating a lot of wealth are not going to become simpler. They're going to become more complex, right? Many politicians are talking, for example, about thousands of jobs that are open in the United States in manufacturing and other areas that are fairly well paid and highly complex, but there are not enough qualified people to do them, right? We can perhaps open as many programs as possible in order to educate the people to do them, but at the same time, it's always a question how many people really do have capability to do them, right? And how many people really do have talent to do them, right? So I'm skeptical that this gap between complexity and capability is just going to widen, right? So there will be a fairly small elite, relatively small elite in world terms, in the global terms, right? That would be able to cope and function in this complex environment, but the rest of the people will be left behind and become, unfortunately, more dispensable workers, unless we basically, not only we, America as a society, but unless societies of the world decide not to leave that entirely to the market, but to do something in terms of distribution of wealth that would basically protect the people of the bottom through intentional policy, right? Where I'm coming from in the 80s and 90s, being a waiter was a career, not somebody that you do during college time, right? Why? Because some people enjoyed it. Some people thought that this was their ability to do so, right? So why would societies undermine these necessary but simpler jobs, right, by lower salaries? Why wouldn't be an intentional effort on part of society as a whole to basically create some level of social justice and not leave good part of it to the market. I do not see these moves towards that. I do not see a move towards intentionally creating more policies that would protect the ones who are become more unequal with the top class, right? I'm just seeing an opposite trend, not only in the United States, but in the rest of the world. Even in Europe, in Sweden, for example, which is one of the most equal countries in the world, the Gini coefficient didn't go lower, didn't go towards more equality. The Gini coefficient basically went up towards more inequality, just because of I mean, the world is not anymore just a bunch of countries who are separated from each other. The world is just one as a market, right? So in order for you to compete for the jobs and for the economy that creates a lot of wealth, you have to create a lot of complexity within the economy. And the question is how much complexity most people can bear.
When we talked about other correlations and how more equal countries had better things such as social trust and educational tests,
Yes.
is the most influential reason because of the economic inequality, or is there other factors?
Countries that are more equal in terms of income have high taxes, right? That basically means that the wealth is distributed from the wealthy to the rest of the society, right? The question always is, what do you do this wealth for, right? Smart countries usually use this wealth in order to create better education with better access for more people, right? Thereby you have a higher test scores, right? Another is social trust, right? Social trust, people usually trust more those who belong to the same class as they do, right? People usually trust more those who are basically in the same, who have the same economic and social values. And so because countries that invest more in equality through high taxes and transfer of wealth from the wealthy, corporations and individuals to the rest of the society, the level of trust among people grows because people feel that they're more equal. They have more similar habits, similar interests, similar education. They belong to the same social class, and therefore they're more likely to trust each other. Right? There's an excellent book about that called The Trust by political scientists, political theorists, I believe, that now he's at Harvard, Francis Fukuyama, who famously in 92 published the book, The End of History. Right? And he also is dealing with social trust. And that's exactly his argument, that because of the transfer of wealth from the high income to lower incomes, the equality rises, and that equality necessarily produces more social trust. For example, in Finland, when they employ teachers, the teacher in Finland is one of the most equal countries in the world, which means it has one of the top 3 lowest Gini coefficients in the world, right? When they employ teachers in the world, only top 5% of the college graduates can become a teacher. You cannot even apply. And they pay them extremely well. Right? Why? Because they understand that education is extremely important. So they already select the teachers and college professors from the entrance. Right? That means that they're investing that wealth that they're distributing from the upper level society to lower level society into something that is creating more equality, and more equality creates social trust and less violence. Right? There is a very strong correlation between the social equality and levels of crime and violence. Right? The more equal the country is, clearly, without any exception, the lower the crime rates. Right? If you go to Sweden, if you go to any Scandinavian country, when crime happens, usually happens within a family for insanity reasons, right? But some gruesome murder or something like that is something that happens in these places maybe once in 2, 3, 4 years, and then the whole country is in shock. We have something like that almost every week. Of course, we have to account that Finland and Norway and Sweden are much smaller countries by population, but still, if you look at the rates, which means how many crimes per certain number of population, it's still incredibly much smaller than in the United States. Why? I think one of the main reasons is the United States has one of the highest Gini coefficients among the developed countries, right? Highest level of inequality. Why is it that the United States is only number 12 in terms of the life expectancy, and it's the wealthiest country in the world? Why? Because it distributes the distribution of income, distribution of wealth in the United States is fairly unequal. So people who are on lower level of economic ladder have much less access to the services that could make their lives better.
The reason why I'm asking this because I just came a little bit late.
I don't understand what you're saying.
Came a little bit late, so that's why
Okay.
I'm asking these questions. If you can define again, like equality and inequality means, and my question is, in your opinion, which method is better for economic growth?
Which one, equality or inequality?
Yep.
I already talked about that, but you probably didn't see it because I define economic inequality in terms of Gini index, right? How much wealth is captured by the top 10 of the wealthiest and how much wealth is captured by the lowest 10 of the poorest, right? And I already mentioned that there are a bunch of studies done, a bunch of correlations done on that particular issue, whether there is a correlation between equality and economic growth. And there is no clear linear correlation. There is no a straight line that says more inequality, better growth, or more inequality, better growth. There is nothing like that, right? But I think that economists, most economists agree that there is optimum amount of inequality that creates incentives for the people to better themselves. But after that, if inequality becomes higher, that basically undermines the social trust, removes the social cohesion, and creates social violence and high level of crime. Right? So there is maybe I can just go back to the curve, right? There is here, right? This is the optimum amount of inequality, and if inequality gets higher, then you have erosion, social cohesion, social conflict, uncertain property rights, and so on and so forth. Right? So it's difficult to say, right? Certain amount inequality is good, but not too little, not too much. How much is enough? It depends on each society. It's very difficult to determine by mathematical formula. Yes, Julian.
Bring it to you. Hold on.
What solution would you suggest for the U.S. to produce more equality while obtaining an optimal level of growth?
More democracy. I mean, my starting point in thinking about politics is every country has the government it deserves. Every country has the structure of government that it deserves. I think the problem of the United States and many other democracies is that most people do not care, really, or most people do not think that any type of political activism or any kind of regular citizen influence on politics is going to change anything for the better, right? So most people do not, and most people, the policies that are being discussed in American politics and elsewhere have become so complex and complicated that most people get bored with those, and most people do not have the intellectual tools to comprehend them, right? So when people vote in the United States and elsewhere, they vote because their family voted a certain way, or because they are one-issue voters. They vote because of abortion issue, or they vote because of a gun issue, or they vote because of the taxes issue, right? But nobody really, no, not nobody, only us political junkies and professionals really pay attention to this really boring grind of nitty-gritty policies that really make difference in people's lives, right? Because there is a widening complexity between how much people know and how much ordinary voters are willing and able to comprehend, and how complex and boring and nitty-gritty the politics has become, right? That basically gives the power to something that in political science we call epistemic communities. Episteme means ancient Greek word for knowledge. So epistemic communities are communities of experts who determine what is knowledge. Communities of experts determine how you acquire scientific knowledge. Communities of experts determine what basically counts as a good information. And they are advising politicians. Right? So this community of experts, because of more and more complex policies, have more and more political power to influence politicians. While most ordinary voters, because they become bored, disinterested, too busy, right, are getting away from politics, which allows experts and politicians to basically do whatever they want. I mean, the Obamacare bill is over 2,000 pages. Most of the members of Congress never read it. It was written by experts, not by people's representatives. It was written by epistemic communities. And at the same time, it's going to influence every ordinary person's life. Right? So because of that gap, right, politicians and experts have a free hand in order to create policies that will basically benefit the people who financially contribute to their campaigns. And most of these people, so-called people, are institutions, large corporations who do not have interest of economic equality in their hearts. So the solution is mobilization of voters, understanding of politics, tweet your representative, email your representative, phone them, send them a love letter. Educate yourself. That's the solution. Otherwise, we all get screwed.
Any other questions? Let's give our speaker another hand.
Thank you.
All for coming.